It is one of the most irresistible images in all of American environmental storytelling. On the Las Vegas Strip, the great casinos blaze with light and roar with air conditioning, cooling tens of millions of visitors a year as they move through a fantasy of manufactured comfort, past dancing fountains and artificial lakes and canals, in the middle of one of the hottest deserts on the continent. And just a few miles away, Lake Mead, the reservoir that gives the city its water, drops another foot, its pale bathtub ring climbing higher up the canyon walls, its surface falling toward the lowest levels ever recorded. The juxtaposition writes itself, decadent excess on one side, dwindling scarcity on the other, the thirsty spectacle of the strip set against the dying lake. As if the casinos were drinking the reservoir dry to keep the party going. It is a powerful image, and it invites an obvious and satisfying conclusion that Las Vegas tourism is wastefully draining the very water it is running out of. Both halves of the picture are literally true. The casinos really do run enormous air conditioning for millions of visitors. And Lake Mead really is dropping toward record lows. But the conclusion the juxtaposition invites, that the one is causing or shamefully contrasting with the other, turns out to be almost entirely wrong, and the real relationship between the strip and the shrinking lake is stranger, more surprising, and more instructive than the easy image of wasteful excess draining a reservoir. Let us start with the water, because it is here that the popular assumption goes most dramatically astray. The intuitive belief is that the great casino resorts, with their fountains and pools and endless hotel rooms, must be enormous drains on the region's scarce water, guzzling the Colorado River to sustain their spectacle. And it is true that the big resorts are, in raw terms, among the largest single water users in the valley. The major properties do appear at the top of the list of commercial consumers. But this raw figure conceals the crucial fact, which is that almost all of the water used inside those resorts is not consumed at all, but recycled. Nearly 100% of the water used indoors in Las Vegas, in the hotel rooms and restaurants and kitchens of the casinos, is captured after use, treated at reclamation facilities, and returned to Lake Mead, from which it can be drawn again. As one water official memorably put it, you could turn on every shower and every faucet in every hotel room on the entire strip, and it would not increase by a single drop the amount of water actually depleted from Lake Mead, because all of that indoor water is reclaimed and sent back to the source. The distinction here is between water used and water consumed, and it is everything. The casinos use a great deal of water, but they consume in the sense of permanently removing it from the system, remarkably little of it. This distinction between using and consuming water is unfamiliar to most people, yet it is the single most important concept for understanding the whole situation, so it is worth making concrete. Imagine borrowing a book from a library versus burning it. If you borrow a book, read it, and return it, you have used it, but the library still has the book, and it can be lent out again and again. If you burn the book, you have consumed it, and it is gone forever. Water in Las Vegas works much the same way. When water flows through a hotel room, a shower, a sink, or a kitchen, and then goes down the drain, it is not destroyed. It is captured, cleaned at a treatment facility, and returned to Lake Mead, where it becomes available to be drawn and used again. Like the borrowed book coming back to the shelf. The city even earns formal credits for the water it returns this way, allowing it to draw an equivalent amount back out. Water that evaporates from a lawn or a golf course or soaks into the ground to grow a crop, by contrast, is gone from the system, consumed like the burned book, not coming back. This is why the raw ranking of water users is so misleading. A casino may sit at the top of the list for water used, drawing enormous quantities through its thousands of rooms, while consuming almost none of it, because nearly all of that water is returned. Judging the casinos by how much water passes through them, rather than by how much they actually remove from the system, is like judging library patrons by how many books they carry home, rather than by how many they fail to bring back. It produces a completely distorted picture of who is really depleting the resource. The famous fountains, the very symbol of supposed desert excess, tell the same surprising story. The dancing fountains outside the Bellagio, that iconic image of water flaunted in the desert, do lose a significant amount of water to evaporation, many millions of gallons a year. But here is the twist that almost no one knows. that water does not come from the Colorado River or from the city's drinking supply at all. It comes from a private groundwater well, brackish water from an old source that once irrigated a golf course on the same site. Water rights that the resort's owners acquired decades ago and that are entirely separate from the community's Lake Mead allocation. The Bellagio fountains, in other words, are not sipping from the reservoir that everyone worries about. They run on their own private, non-potable water. And this is the rule rather than the exception on the Strip. All of the outdoor fountains at the resorts operate on recycled, closed-loop systems, constantly filtering and reusing the same water rather than drawing fresh supply. And new rules now prohibit resorts from building any new outdoor water feature at all, unless it runs entirely on private water rights or is located indoors where the water can be reclaimed. The spectacle of aquatic abundance, so central to the image of wasteful Vegas, is very largely an illusion as far as the region's actual water supply is concerned. Put these facts together, and the numbers become startling. Taken as a whole, the casinos and hotels of Las Vegas, the entire glittering tourism industry that seems to embody desert waste, use less than 8% of the region's water, most of it in the hotel rooms, and nearly all of even that small share is recycled and returned to the lake. The tourism economy that draws 40 million visitors a year, that runs the fountains and fills the pools and cools the endless casino floors, is simply not the great water drain that the popular image insists it must be. It is, on the contrary, one of the more water-efficient parts of a remarkably water-efficient city, its consumption dwarfed by other uses, and its indoor water almost entirely reclaimed. The Strip looks like the villain of the story, the obvious culprit whenever people search for someone to blame for the falling lake, but the numbers simply do not support the accusation. The casinos are a symbol people reach for, a vivid and satisfying target, but they are not the cause of Lake Mead's decline, and pointing at them is, in the most literal sense, looking in the wrong direction. So if not the casinos, then what is actually draining the Colorado River and dropping Lake Mead? The honest answer points away from the neon of the Strip entirely, toward two much larger and much less photogenic culprits. The first, within the city itself, is not indoor water use at all, but outdoor landscaping, the watering of lawns and grass and golf courses, which is genuinely consumptive because that water evaporates and soaks away rather than returning to be reclaimed. This is precisely why Las Vegas has waged such an aggressive war on ornamental grass, banning it and paying residents to tear it out. Because outdoor irrigation, not the casino fountains, is where the real municipal water loss occurs. But the second and far larger culprit lies entirely outside the city, indeed outside the state, across the whole vast basin of the Colorado River. The overwhelming majority of the river's water, across the 7 states and the tribal nations and the part of Mexico that depend on it, goes not to cities at all, but to agriculture, and within agriculture. An astonishing share goes to a single crop, alfalfa, a thirsty forage grown to feed cattle, which alone accounts for something approaching half of all the water drawn from the entire Colorado River system. The reservoir is falling because of a decades-long megadrought intensified by a warming climate, because the river was over-allocated on paper generations ago, and because vast quantities of its water are used to grow feed for livestock across the West. The dancing fountains of the Bellagio have essentially nothing to do with it. The scale of this mismatch between perception and reality is genuinely staggering when you lay it out plainly. The entire state of Nevada is allocated only a tiny sliver of the Colorado River, less than 2% of the total. The smallest share of any of the 7 states that draw upon it, and Las Vegas, with all its casinos and fountains and 40 million annual visitors, fits within that tiny sliver. Meanwhile, agriculture across the basin consumes the overwhelming majority of the river, and a single thirsty crop grown to feed cattle uses close to half of the entire river's water all by itself. To put it starkly, the water used to grow hay for livestock dwarfs, many times over, everything that Las Vegas does with water, casinos and all. And yet it is the casinos, not the alfalfa fields, that appear in the dramatic photographs and the viral posts. Because a glittering fountain in front of a luxury hotel makes for a far more compelling image of waste than an unremarkable green field in a rural valley. This is precisely how the misperception takes hold. The eye is drawn to the vivid and the famous, while the real drivers. being mundane and remote, escape attention entirely. It is not that anyone is necessarily lying, it is that the truth is unphotogenic and the falsehood is spectacular, and in a world that thinks in images, the spectacular falsehood wins. Correcting this is not about defending the casinos, which have their own real problems, but about directing scarce attention and scarce political will toward the places where they can actually make a difference, which is emphatically not the fountains of the Strip. Now let us turn to the other half of the title, the air conditioning, because here too the juxtaposition quietly misleads, though in a subtler way. The image invites you to file the casino air conditioning alongside the falling lake as if they were the same kind of thing, two aspects of a single wasteful thirst. But air conditioning, for the most part, does not consume water at all, it consumes electricity. The vast cooling systems that keep the casino floors comfortable work by moving heat, powered by the electrical grid. And that grid in southern Nevada draws on a mix of natural gas, solar power, and hydropower, not by directly pumping the drinking water out of Lake Mead. So the enormous energy the Strip uses to cool its millions of visitors is, in the first instance, a story about power, not about water, and to lump it together with the falling reservoir is to blur two genuinely different resources. The casino running its air conditioning is not, in any direct sense, lowering the level of the lake. And yet, having said that, honesty requires acknowledging that the connection between the cooling and the water is not entirely absent. It is simply more indirect and more interesting than the crude juxtaposition suggests. There are, in fact, several real threads linking the two. The first is genuinely surprising. For many years, some of the big casinos and other buildings cooled themselves using a technique called evaporative cooling, which chills air by passing it over water and letting that water evaporate, a method that does directly consume water, and a great deal of it, something like 1/10 of the entire region's water allocation. Recognizing this, the water authorities have moved to ban evaporative cooling in new buildings, precisely to sever that direct link between cooling and water use. So there really was a water cost to cooling in Las Vegas, a real version of the connection the title gestures at, and the city has been actively working to eliminate it. This detail about evaporative cooling is worth lingering on, because it is the one place where the title's instinct is genuinely onto something, even if it does not know it. Evaporative cooling, sometimes called swamp cooling, works on a simple principle. As water evaporates, it absorbs heat, cooling the air around it, which is why a breeze off a lake or a wet cloth on the skin feels cool. In a dry desert climate, this method can be quite effective and, importantly, uses far less electricity than conventional refrigerated air conditioning, which is why it was historically popular in the Southwest, including in many large buildings. But its efficiency with electricity comes at a direct cost in water, because the whole method depends on continuously evaporating water into the air. Water that is genuinely consumed and does not return. In a region drawing on a shrinking river, that water cost eventually came to outweigh the energy savings, and so the water authorities have moved to phase the method out of new construction, choosing to spend more electricity in order to save water. It is a revealing trade-off, a small window into the constant balancing of water against energy that defines life in the desert, and it shows that the relationship between cooling and water is real and consequential in its own particular way. The city, characteristically, spotted the problem and acted on it, severing yet another thread of unnecessary water consumption. The second thread runs through the dam itself. Lake Mead does not only supply drinking water, it also generates electricity, because Hoover Dam produces hydropower from the water passing through it, and as the lake falls, the dam's capacity to generate that power declines, so that the very drought lowering the reservoir also erodes one of the region's sources of the electricity that the air conditioning depends on. The water crisis and the energy question are genuinely entangled, just not in the simple way the image implies. The third and most diffuse connection is the one that ultimately matters most, and it reframes the whole relationship between the casinos and the lake. The enormous energy that the Strip consumes to cool its millions of visitors, insofar as it comes from burning fossil fuels, contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions that drive global warming, and that warming is a central cause of the very megadrought that is draining Lake Mead. So there is a real link between the air conditioning and the falling reservoir, but it runs through the global climate rather than through the local plumbing, not the direct one the juxtaposition implies, of cooling somehow sucking up lake water, but an indirect and planetary one, in which the energy consumed for cooling anywhere adds incrementally to the warming that is drying the whole region. It is a real connection, but it is diffuse, shared by every energy user on Earth, and it makes the Las Vegas casinos not a special villain, but simply one participant among billions in the global process that is heating the planet and shrinking the river. To single out the Strip for this is to miss that the same charge applies in proportion to nearly all of modern industrial civilization. None of this is to say that there is nothing to question about the casinos or about Las Vegas tourism, and it is worth being fair to the legitimate concern buried inside the misleading image. There is a genuine and reasonable debate to be had about the wisdom and the fairness of running a vast, resource-intensive tourism economy, an economy of spectacle and comfort and endless cooling, in one of the most water-stressed and heat-stressed deserts on the continent. One can reasonably ask whether the sheer scale of energy consumption is sustainable, whether the priorities are right, whether a place built on luxury and excess is the wisest thing to plant in so fragile an environment. These are fair questions, and they deserve honest discussion. But they are different questions from the false one the title's juxtaposition implies. The legitimate question is philosophical and long-term, about the wisdom of resource-intensive spectacle in a fragile desert. The false question is causal and immediate. The accusation that the casinos are directly draining the lake, and it is that causal accusation, not the philosophical concern, that the facts decisively refute. Keeping these two questions separate matters, because conflating them corrupts both. When people fold the legitimate long-term concern into the false immediate accusation, they end up making an argument that is easy to dismiss, because the moment someone points out that the casinos recycle their water and run their fountains on private wells, the entire critique appears to collapse, and the genuine question about desert sustainability gets thrown out along with the false charge of direct draining. The casinos, by being demonstrably innocent of the specific accusation, are able to appear innocent of everything, and the real debate never happens. A clearer approach keeps the accurate accounting and the philosophical question apart, conceding freely that the Strip is not draining Lake Mead, while still asking the harder question of whether the whole model of desert spectacle is wise. What emerges, then, is a picture far more nuanced and more honest than the satisfying image of decadent casinos drinking a dying reservoir dry. The casinos do run enormous air conditioning for millions of visitors, and Lake Mead really is dropping, foot by foot, toward record lows. But the casinos are not the cause of the lake's decline. They are among the most water-efficient operations in a strikingly efficient city, using less than a tenth of the region's water and recycling nearly all of it, their fountains fed by private wells, their indoor water returned to the source. The lake is falling because of drought and warming and over-allocation, and above all, agriculture, not because of the Strip. And the air conditioning connects to the water not through any direct draining, but through the subtler channels of the now banned evaporative cooling, the declining hydropower of a shrinking dam, and the diffuse global warming to which all energy use contributes. The true story is not one of a simple villain caught in the act, but of a tangled web of water and energy and climate in which the obvious culprit turns out to be largely innocent of the specific crime it is accused of, and the real causes lie elsewhere, less visible and less photogenic, in distant farms and a warming atmosphere and a river promised to too many. So let us return, at the end, to the image we began with and judge it honestly. Are Las Vegas casinos running air conditioning for millions of visitors while Lake Mead drops another foot? Yes, both of those things are literally, simultaneously true, and the image is as striking as ever. But the conclusion it quietly invites, that the thirsty, wasteful spectacle of the Strip is draining the shrinking lake, is almost entirely false. The casinos are not the cause of Lake Mead's decline. They consume less than 8% of the region's water and recycle nearly all of it. Their famous fountains run on private wells rather than the Colorado, and you could open every tap on the Strip without lowering the lake by a drop. Because the water comes back. The reservoir is falling for reasons that have little to do with tourism and much to do with drought, warming, over-allocation, and above all the vast agricultural thirst of the wider West. And the air conditioning, real and enormous as it is, connects to the water not by draining it directly, but through the subtler and more honest channels of energy and climate. The striking juxtaposition, in the end, is a kind of optical illusion, drawing the eye toward the brightest and most obvious target, while the real causes work quietly out of frame. And seeing past that illusion, understanding that the visible villain is not the true one, is exactly the kind of clear sight that the difficult problems of water in the West will urgently require if they are ever to be honestly understood and genuinely solved.